My name is Philip Verre, and I am the Chief Operating Officer here at the High Museum of Art. And this husky young man is the topic of my talk tonight. It's the personification of the River Tiber. Dates from about 100 A.D., about 12 feet long and weighs about 5 tons, so no light subject matter. But it's a wonderful object that is really the cornerstone of the year 2 of the Louvre-Atlanta partnership, the Louvre in the Ancient World. And not only is it a magnificent piece of art, but it's also has in it a wonderful history, a wonderful story about the travels of this piece from the ancient world to the world of the Renaissance, to the world of the Napoleonic era, to the present-day world of the Louvre, and ultimately coming to Atlanta as part of the Louvre in the ancient world. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about that journey, that story, but also the piece represents something more than that, and I'm going to try to give you a sense of that, of how the ancient world, and specifically great works of art of the ancient world, have somehow captivated those of us who have come after ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and generations and decades and centuries of leaders who look to the past as inspiration and direction for the future. And the River Tiber plays a very important part in that history as well. So, what is it? And Kevin, if we could dim the lights a little bit more, maybe, that might be good. Thank you. So what is it about the ancient world that continues to obsess and fascinate people? For those who are scholars, collectors, who are writers, and who are artists, the ancient world, the world of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, remain an incredible rich source of inspiration, of knowledge, and ultimately of truth. So for generations up through the present time, artists have continually looked to the past to try to make more of what they know of the ancient world. And here is sort of a fantasy picture from the 17th, 18th century artist, Italian artist Gianpaolo Panini. And this is sort of a fantasy of the ancient world, and this would have been the delight of those people who were antiquarians, who were historians, those who were traveling to Italy as part of the Grand Tour, be it from America or from Great Britain, discovering the past through painting, through architecture, and through sculpture. And you see throughout this work some of the great masterpieces of ancient art, the Farnese Hercules, the Laocoon, and we'll come back to that later, the Dying Gladiator, and then some wonderful sort of fantasy paintings of ancient architecture, all housed in this actual piece of ancient architecture, again, which is sort of a fictive creation of the artist. But it's not only a fascination for artists, an inspiration for artists, but it's also been an obsession for world leaders who somehow, in their own time, want to create a new Rome. And why the new Rome? Well, Rome of the past, Rome of the ancient world, has served as a model for those who desire supreme domination over the world, those who desire economic prosperity, those who desire to be head of one of the great civilizations when it comes to art and culture. So be it our friend Napoleon, whose statue graces the lobby of the Wheeling Pavilion, or Louis Francois I in the 16th century, or Philip IV of Spain in the 16th century, or perhaps even Charles I of England in the 17th century. And then, of course, we have the Louis XIV, XV, and XVI of the 17th and 18th century. The ancient world was an inspiration, but it was also an obsession, and I use that word carefully because they definitely look back as the past as a way of legitimizing their rule as rulers of the contemporary world. And how does one do that? Well, one can dress up in classical garb like Napoleon does here in the 1808 statue by Lamotte, or he's here rendered as a emperor, as a Caesar, in fact, by Antoine Barye. Another way of doing it is also obviously to acquire great works of art from the ancient world, be it actual Greek art, but as those are very rare, more often there would be copies, Roman copies of the ancient Greek art. And then if you couldn't get an actual Roman copy, the next best thing to do was to actually hire somebody, and very often these would be artists or artisans, to make plaster molds of those works of ancient Roman art that were excavated, rediscovered, and to bring those molds back to your court or to your chateau or to your capital city, and to make mostly marble copies, but sometimes actual bronze copies. So in the case of the rulers of Western Europe in the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, if you couldn't get the original, and very often you would try to get that very difficult original, but if you couldn't get it, a copy was just fine. And actually this whole ethic of looking back at the ancient world obviously came to America as well, and here we see Horatio Greenough's 1840 statue of George Washington. Not George Washington as an emperor, not George Washington as one of the Caesars, but actually George Washington as a member of the Senate of the Republic of Rome. So for those new countries who grew out of revolution, out of democracy, the look back to ancient Rome was not to imperial Rome, but to Republic Rome. And then, of course, perhaps the greatest inspiration of the classical world in America is in the port of New York, the Statue of Liberty, which remains a point of inspiration, of patriotism, of transformation for this country. And then we take it in the late 20th century to sort of the ridiculous and the absurd, but nonetheless the introduction of the classical world into popular culture. And here's our good friend John Belushi from Animal House. So even to this day, the classical world, be it the Statue of Liberty or actors on a 20th century comedy, the classical world is still part of us. But let's get back in time, let's go back in time to the ancient world and talk a little bit about the importance of classical sculpture. And I want to pinpoint a place in time, and that's early 16th century Rome, specifically the Vatican, the rule of Julius II as Pope at the time, Julius II who commissioned Michelangelo to do the Great Sistine Chapel ceiling, Julius II who commissioned Raphael to do the frescoes for the Pope's private quarters. But this was also a Pope who was trying to legitimize the Papal States as a leader of the Italian country, a country that was truly fragmented until well into the 19th century. And a way, again, of legitimizing the role of the papacy in the early 16th century was to look back to the past. And during the early part of the 16th century, as Rome was starting to rebuild, as Rome was starting to inherit the role of the leading Renaissance city from Florence, a lot of excavation was taking place. A lot of new public buildings, a lot of new private villas and homes were being built. Hence, there was a lot of discoveries of the ancient world. One of the greatest discoveries was the Belvedere Apollo in the early part of that century, which is today, back then and still today, considered one of the great masterpieces of the ancient world. So as these pieces were discovered, and very often the only person who could afford to acquire them was the Pope at the time, many of the key works of the classical world came to the Vatican collection. And in fact, Julius II was so taken by a number of these discoveries through these archaeological excavations that he created a special gallery, the Galleria Belvedere, as part of the Vatican museums. And it's here that the greatest examples of the classical world were gathered. So joining the Apollo was the Laocoon, which was discovered in January of 1506 and considered one of the great finds of the time. So important, though, that Julius II summoned Michelangelo from the scaffolding of the Sistine Chapel to come to the excavation site to help with the recovery of this important work. And then here is the sleeping Cleopatra, again, one of the great finds, which was excavated just outside the city of Rome in February of 1512. And Cleopatra, along with the Laocoon and the Belvedere, were part of the core collection of the Galleria Belvedere of Julius II. And then just a year after the Tiber was excavated, this piece, the Nile, which was a companion piece to the Nile, was excavated. And so this was also bought by Julius, brought to the Vatican museums, and installed in the Belvedere gallery. And then here is our main topic, the Tiber, the personification of the Tiber. Excavated in January 1512, just outside the city walls of Rome, it was part of a sculpture program along with the Nile River, which you just saw, as a temple devoted to the two Egyptian gods, Isis and Serapis. And these were Egyptian gods, but they also had holding and sway in other civilizations as well, hence such a temple in the city of Rome. On February 2nd of the same year, 1512, this sculpture was acquired by Julius II for the Vatican collections, and in August of that year was actually installed in the middle of the Belvedere gallery by Julius. So the Tiber took center stage, literally, in the most important collection of ancient art. And here's a closer look at this wonderful, wonderful example of classical world, again, from about 100 A.D., you take a look at his head here and you see not only do you have a garland, but you have this wonderful hair and beard, which really reads both as hair, but also as dripping seaweed, appropriately enough for a river god. And he's accompanied by the cornucopia, which is beautifully sculpted here, and which is a symbol of the prosperity that is brought about from commerce and trade on the river Tiber. And then here, this is what really identifies the god, the personage as the Tiber, and you see here the two fictive founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, and to their left, the wolf that nurtured them in their infancy when they were abandoned. So the river god, Tiber, comes to the Vatican and takes center stage for a good number of centuries. And then just this wonderful, when you have an opportunity to see the piece, please be sure to actually take a look at these wonderful, sort of very shallow engravings, almost relief-like sculpture that frames the entire work on its base. Now, this work was well known, as most of the great works of antiquity were well known. So not only, as I mentioned, were copies made, but also these rather deluxe portfolio editions were made for collectors, for kings, for noblemen. And here is an example of a 16th century engraving by the Dutch artist Goltzius, which is taking a look at the Tiber and making his own engraving. And what's quite wonderful, as you start to take a look at these, not only these printed matter, these works on paper, but also sculptural copies, three-dimensional copies, you really see that the artists start to take their own artistic liberties with the work of art. So you see here how perhaps the she-wolf, Romulus and Remus, are differently placed. Here, you could see that the oar, actually, that the Tiber is holding was probably broken when it was first excavated, and the oar that you now see today is actually a latter-day restoration edition. And here's another example of the work from one of these books from about 1560, so just literally 40 or 50 years after its discovery or rediscovery. And again, look at the freedom of interpretation by this artist. And then here's a work a little bit later. It gives you another sense of how it's portrayed. And here's a wonderful watercolor from about just the latter part of the 16th century, about 1575, 1580, which shows a view of the Tiber in the gallery at the Vatican. Now, I told you before, when it was first excavated and put on display, it was put in this beautiful gallery, the Galleria Belvedere, but subsequent popes and subsequent directors of the Vatican Museum rearranged it and put it in different installations. And here it is actually the centerpiece of what is called the Gallery of Animals. But this dates from just the latter part of the 16th century. See it here holding center court with rather some exotic visitors, some family visitors as well here. That hasn't changed, has it? The child is preoccupied with something else. Now, it's interesting that the original Tiber that you see on display here at the High Museum eventually did go to Paris in the latter part of the 18th century. But in fact, the Tiber had arrived in Paris well before Napoleon brought it there. In the 1540s, Francois I actually made a bronze life-size cast of the work for his chateau in Fontainebleau. And Francois I was one of the first rulers of the Western world who envied the ancient world of Rome and actually wanted to create a new Rome in France. And he felt, as the leader of that country, it was his responsibility to create the new Rome in Paris and to make Paris and France the new republic, the new leader of the world, inspired by the ancient world. So he created the life-size bronze version of the Tiber. That was actually melted down, destroyed and melted down during the Revolution in the year 1792. Sometime between 1688 and 1715, the French artist Pietro Magni made a life-size marble copy of the Tiber, and it was Louis XIV who ultimately brought it to its present location, which is at the north end of the Tuileries Gardens, which you see here. So it's been there actually since about 1745, 1750. And then also, as copies were made for different collectors, for different patrons, you could see that artists continued to take greater liberties with the original work of art. So what you see here is a reduced statue, what we call a statuette of the River Tiber. And it actually dates from the late 17th century, the early 18th century, and measures about 7 or 8 inches by about 9 inches. So literally it's a small piece that you put on a shelf or in a cabinet. And what's quite interesting here is that this artist has taken the liberty of combining the symbols of the Tiber and the Nile together. So he truly has created sort of a two-river statuette. But these were the types of works that were copied and sold to wealthy patrons, to leaders of countries, and ultimately to museums. They weren't cheap. The common person or the middle-class person, once that class was developed, could not afford them. So they were truly items of luxury. And here's an engraving of a collector's gallery in Paris, the Gallery Girardin. And this is a private collector, and this dates from about, I think they say about 1700 here. And here you could see little statuettes of probably both the Nile and the Tiber. So by the time the 17th and 18th century roll around, not only do you have the original antiquities, not only do you have full-size casts, but now there is basically this business of reproducing the statues in smaller sizes for sale to wealthy patrons. Now, there are a few examples of when actual antiquities reached other countries other than the Vatican or the Papal States. And here's a wonderful example. This is the Diana the Huntress, and this is an actual Roman copy of an original Greek bronze. And documents show that this was located at the chateau at Fontainebleau sometime in 1584, 1585. This would have been after the time of Francois Premier, so somehow it arrived in France. We don't know how and under what circumstances, but it truly became one of the centerpieces of the French royal collection. It was moved to Versailles by Louis XIV in about 1662 or 1663. And then again, as the world and the business of copies continued, here is a wonderful example, actually in the collection of the High Museum of Art. This is a work that dates from 1782 by the artist Pierre Julien. And if you go through our permanent collection galleries in the Stent Family Wing, you'll see this on display in our European galleries. Now here comes the sort of main antagonist of tonight's story, and it's Napoleon. And Napoleon had the same dreams as Francois I, Louis XIV, XV, and XVI, Charles I of England, Philip IV of Spain, to create a new Rome, and to create that Rome in Paris. But Napoleon wasn't satisfied with copies. Napoleon wanted the real thing. So on the occasion of his successful Italian campaign in 1796, when he conquered the Papal States, he made it a condition of peace, of armistice, that 100 objects of the greatest objects from the public collections and from the church collections of Italy would come to Paris. And he actually named one object of that 100 at the initial signing of the armistice. And it's this piece here. And it's quite a wonderful piece in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And it's the head of Lucius Junius Brutus, who was the legendary founder of the Roman Republic. So here it is, Napoleon, who's yet to be named emperor, actually choosing the bust of the leading republic in Rome as the first piece to leave Italy under the Armistice of Bologna, which was signed on June 18, 1796. In February 1797, so just a few months later, a treaty is signed with the Papal States. It's the Treaty of Tolentino. And at that point, Napoleon draws up his list of 100 objects that are to leave the Papal States and come to Paris, ultimately to come to the Louvre as part of the new Museum of Antiquities and the Napoleon Museum, which were founded and opened in the early 1800s. And the Tiber is one of them. No surprise, as it was one of the major antiquities in the Vatican collection. The Laocoon was included also in the list of 100 items that were to be taken out of Rome and the Vatican as a result of the Treaty of Tolentino. The Cleopatra was yet another one. And of course the Apollo Belvedere, which remained perhaps the most important, the most recognized, and most appreciated ancient statue in the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. Also on the list were the four horses of San Marco in Venice. And it's sort of curious how these got on there because actually Venice, which at that time was under the sovereign of Austria, there was a separate treaty, but somehow the four horses got onto the list of that came out of the Treaty of Tolentino. So I'm not sure how Napoleon claimed these under a treaty that had to do with the Vatican and the Papal States. But nonetheless, the four horses were dismantled from San Marco and made their way to Paris. And one of the great works from, again, the Capitoline Museums, one of the great appreciated works is the Spinario. In this case, this is a bronze work from the early Roman centuries of the after Christ. And then the Venus de Medici, which was not in the collection of the Vatican, but actually was owned by the Medici family. And this work actually, once Napoleon started to cross into the Papal States territory, the Medici family tried to hide this work by shipping it to Palermo, and it only got as far as Naples, and at that point Naples had actually a treaty with France, so it was turned over to Napoleon by the King of Naples and then shipped to Paris. And then again, the Dying Gladiator, which came from the Capitoline Museums, one of the great pieces of classical art. Now, there were other ways that Napoleon acquired great classical art. Not all of it was by appropriation or as war booty. In this case, we have the Borghese Gladiator. And what Napoleon did here was his sister Pauline was married to Prince Camillo Borghese, and the prince was having a hard time financially, so Napoleon decided to buy his collection of antiquities for a rather inflated price. So this work actually came via purchase as opposed to war appropriation. And another example of how Napoleon was able to acquire works of art, and this is actually a work that is in the Eye of Josephine exhibition on the second floor in the Ancock's Chambers wing, was that this was given to him as a peace offering by the King of Naples, Ferdinand IV, in 1802. And it's worth mentioning that while Rome and ancient Rome and excavations around Rome were the primary source of classical antiquities, in this mid-18th century, starting at around 1734 and continuing through today, a new major source of ancient statuary were the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum. So this is a great work, a bronze Hercules, that dates sometime before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, that is AD 79. one of several works that were actually collected by King Ferdinand for his museum, Portici, in Naples, but ultimately was given to Napoleon and his wife, the Empress Josephine, as a gift, as a peace offering. And many of these works, as you'll find out in the galleries, found their way to Malmaison, which was the private residence that Napoleon and Josephine decorated with these great objects just outside of Paris. So these works were packed up starting in 1797. Some of them sat in Rome for a while. Some of them slowly made their way to Paris. And they generally were shipped via boat from Livorno to Marseille and then carriaged up to Rome. And here's one of the great graphics from about 1798. And as you can read, it's the triumphal entry of the monuments of sciences and arts into France. And so it's important to note that Napoleon's appropriations were not only artworks, but also anything else that was of interest to him. And as he did have a keen interest in science and the natural world, very often you would see other things other than objects coming to Paris. And what you see here are a couple camels. Here you see some lions. And here, hopefully you can make out, are the 4 horses, the bronze horses from San Marco. On the occasion of this procession, and there were several processions, several, as I mentioned, trips, shipments of works of art from the Vatican States to Paris, starting in 1797 and really stretching up to the last year of Napoleon's reign, 1814. More and more works came into the Louvre, as part of this expatriation program, basically. On the occasion of the first procession, of which you see the graphic here, the French Minister of Interior actually commissioned a popular vaudeville team to write a popular song that people would sing as they experienced the procession. And basically the lyrics go, "Rome is no longer in Rome, all of her is now in Paris." So literally the world is the new Rome, has now been transferred from the old Rome, from the Vatican States, to the capital of Paris. And the next slide is another graphic, and this is a document from about 1800, which shows the works arriving at the Louvre, being uncrated, and onlookers watching the opening of the crates. We don't do it like that anymore here at the museum, or any museum. We take a lot more control over what we do. So basically, these works were transferred from the Vatican States to Paris starting in 1797 up to 1815. Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo, and immediately the monarchy is reinstalled in Paris, and this whole reversal of artwork begins almost immediately. And here is a fresco which is actually in one of the Vatican galleries. It's by a Spanish artist by the name of Francisco Ayes, and it recounts the return of objects from the Louvre Museum to the Vatican museums. And if you take a close look, you could see the convoy of crates and horse-drawn crates here. And it's interesting that the artist has chosen a river god very similar to the river Tiber as the onlooker, as the spectator of this wonderful return of works of art to the Vatican. The person in charge of the negotiations with the new French monarch to return the works to the Vatican was the great neoclassical sculptor Antonio Canova. Now, Canova had actually made a statue of Napoleon as emperor, in 1807. Napoleon didn't like it. So it just sort of sat somewhere for a while. But as Napoleon was negotiating with the Vatican, with the Louvre, on behalf of the Vatican, there was the idea of an exchange. So the king, Charles XVIII of France, wanted to keep the Tiber for the collection of the Louvre. Canova said, okay, that's fine. Why don't I, in exchange, give the Vatican the statue of Napoleon that I made a few years earlier, which he didn't like. And the Vatican seemed to have agreed to that. However, as we've been starting to research this situation a little bit more closely, we found, A, that the Tiber stayed at the Louvre and has become part of its permanent collection per an agreement with Charles XVIII. But in fact, B, the statue by Napoleon, by Canova, was never brought to the Vatican. In fact, it was given as a gift by King Louis XVIII to the Duke of Wellington. And there it sits today in Apsley House in London. A very poor slide, but this is the best we could do of the actual marble slide. But here's a clearer bronze example, the same statue, a little bit larger, that sits in the court of the Verre Museum in Milan. So here it is. The Tiber stays in Rome as part of an exchange with the Vatican that truly never takes place. So that's a little new discovery we made, helped by our colleagues in Paris. And just fast forwarding to 1875, here's a wonderful installation photograph of the Tiber in the Antiquities Gallery in the Louvre. And here is the Diana the Huntress. Again, that wonderful work that somehow found its way into France, to the Chateau Fontainebleau sometime in the late 16th century. And so there the Tiber sat, installed in the Louvre galleries in 1802 until literally just a few weeks ago. So in order to prepare it for its trip to Atlanta from Paris, a group of conservators and technicians created this marvelous steel cradle, which is currently supporting the work. Newly fabricated, scaffolding is put up around the statue, rigging is put in place to lift it and to create it and to prepare the work for its trip to Atlanta as part of Louvre and the ancient world. And here it is under the cover of darkness, the dark of night. The work is being unloaded in a crate at Art Center Way into the lobby of the Ancock's Chambers wing through this little sculpture terrace that sits just to the west of the gallery. And here it is being installed in the Ancock's Chambers lobby. So as you might imagine, a great number of people working on this, not only riggers, but also conservators, registrars, and curators. And everything went according to plan, which is quite wonderful. And here it sits today. So that's basically the story, but I want to just sort of fast forward you to our own time and just let you know that the theme of water, or the subject of water as inspiration for artists, continues to this day. And not only so, the River Tiber remained an inspiration for artists like Bernini, who in the 1650s did his wonderful Four Rivers fountain in the Piazza Navona, celebrating the rivers Ganges, Rio Plata, Nile, and Danube. And here's the personification of the Ganges River right here. In America, the Philadelphia artist William Rush executed this work in approximately 1828, and it's the river Schuylkill, freed, and that had to do with the taming of the river for industrial purposes. Here's a wonderful work by the Italian artist from the mid-19th century, Pietro Magni, entitled Monument to Commemorate the Cutting of the Suez Canal. And there again you could see right out of the River Tiber. Here are the hieroglyphics, which again reference the Egyptian world where the Suez Canal was being created. And this comes from the Columbian Exposition of 1893, a temporary work by William McMonnies, the great American sculptor, which celebrates the arrival, or triumph, I should say, of Columbia. And then closer to our own time, one of the great works by the abstract sculptor David Smith, entitled The Hudson River Landscape. And this was actually inspired by a train ride along the Hudson River that the artist took up to his studio in the Lake George area in upstate New York. And then perhaps most recently, this is Robert Smithson's earthwork entitled Spiral Jetty, which dates from 1970. And here is truly sort of a how art is embedded in the environment itself, one of the great earth art works of that generation. So there you have it. We return to Louvre, Atlanta. We return to the great River Tiber. Hopefully that provided you with some context, and with that I invite you to go through the galleries and enjoy Louvre and the ancient world. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have any questions and want to come up, or Lauren's going to get a mic, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you.
We record these lectures, and they're posted on the AtlantaForumNetwork.org. So if you would, just speak clearly into the microphone, and if you don't wish to have your question recorded, just let me know. Raise your hands, though, if you have a question. Anybody?
How did they move this from Europe to over to Atlanta? How was it? By train? I mean, by plane or?
Plane, cargo plane.
Really?
Cargo plane. We were just managed to fit into the opening of the cargo plane. So, truck to the airport, plane to Atlanta, truck to the High Museum, and hoisting up to the level where you see it today.
How are the pieces chosen?
For the exhibition?
Right.
Well, this is a good question. Actually, the Louvre Atlanta is a true collaboration in the fullest sense. So not only is it a collaboration between two institutions, but the topics of exhibitions and the choice of works that go into each of those exhibitions is really chosen collectively by curators here at the High Museum as well as the Louvre curators. So this process, as you might imagine, takes several years to come up with a theme and then the works of art to support the theme. But really it is a partnership involving curators at both ends, the Louvre and the High Museum. So once you come up with a theme, the work somewhat narrows down. And then, of course, you have to look into issues like, is the work in a stable enough condition to travel? Does it need some conservation work? Is it promised to another museum as a loan? Is it so important, i.e. like the Mona Lisa, that the Louvre could never lend it because it would disappoint the 8.4 million visitors who go there every year? So there are a lot of factors that go into it, but ultimately this has really been a true curatorial collaboration as well as an institutional one.
Are all the operational officers as articulate about the subject matter as you are? And if so, how do you find people like that?
Well, I have a background in art history, and somehow I was appointed chief operating officer somewhere along the way. But my training and my love is in art and art history. So, but thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. But I think all of us who work at the museum, be it a guard or an engineer, are truly not only inspired by the artwork, but also by the important work we do here at the museum for the community. So thank you all for coming, and please enjoy your visit to the High Museum tonight.